Welcome to lesson 1.2 on grouping data. We're going to first start by grouping discrete data, so that data that is got certain values, can't take any value on a scale, and then continuous data that can take any value on a scale. Please can I remind you to review your flashcards between lessons, prior to lessons. Can you remember what qualitative, quantitative, continuous, discrete is, as well as all the different types of data that you've been told about, the bivariate, the multivariate, the etc. Okay, all of those different ones that you needed. Okay, so we keyword today is class interval, and class interval is the group that you put the data into. We will go through that when we get to it. Right, a computer game company wants to know the ages of people playing its game, and it's taking a sample of 20 people. These are the ages. We can group the data. Why would we group the data? The main reason we're going to group the data is because if we try to display that data on any type of bar chart, it would produce something that looked like that. Not very informative, a bit of a mess. Okay, so we're going to group the data into different class intervals. Now, how you group the data is important, and there's a few key things that you need to know. So we could, for example, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, and 40 to 50. But as I've said here, there is a problem. And the problem is what we call an overlap. You cannot have an overlap when you're grouping data, okay? So no overlap. The reason you can't have the overlap is you wouldn't be sure which category to put the 20 into. Okay, so no overlap is absolutely key. Okay, so discrete data can be grouped into class lists that do not overlap. Can you get that please on a flashcard, on a key point? The groups 0 to 10, 11 to 20, this is what are called the class intervals. Okay, so those actual groups are called the class intervals. The intervals do not need to be equal widths. We could have done 0 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 24. It doesn't matter, okay? If you've got more data in a particular age category, then you would split it a little more. For example, if we had the 0 to 10 category and I had 0 to 10 and I had 20 pieces of data in that category, and then I had the 11 to 20 category and I had 50 pieces of data in that category, you might want to start to break down the 11 to 20 a little bit further, maybe into 11 to 15, 16 to 18, 19 to 20, just as an example. So where you have more data in a particular region, we tend to use narrower intervals to get more information about that particular class interval. Pause the video and get down the key notes, please, you need from there. Okay, so once we've grouped the data, we're going to have something that looks a little bit more like this. Now, for discrete data, we have gaps between the bars. Discrete data, there needs to be the gaps, okay? And you can see, look, now there's no overlap. 10 to 19, 20 to 29, etc. Okay? Now, when we're moving on to grouped data for continuous data. Let's just put a title there of continuous. So the other one was discrete data, and for discrete data you want the gaps in the bars. We're now on to continuous data. So if we want the record, for example, of a post office, taking a sample of the weight of 20 letters, here's the weights. You can see it's continuous because it's a mass and it can be any value on a scale. But there's another problem now we need to consider. So the previous problem was that we couldn't have overlaps, which is great, we haven't got overlaps. But this is continuous data. We could have data that fits between the 29 and 30. For example, 29.5. Where would that data go? Where would the data for 39.2 go? Okay, so the problem here is that there are gaps in the data. So the previous slide showed you that you can't have overlap, but also you cannot have gaps in the class intervals. And the only way to overcome this with the continuous data is for us to start to use inequalities, okay? So if we use M for the mass of the letters, this category here would show greater than or equal to 20, but you could have less than 30. And then the next class interval, you could have greater than or equal to 30, but less than 40. The next one, greater than or equal to 40, but less than 50. Greater than or equal to 50, but less than 60. And be careful with these inequalities. You can see that if you had a 30, 30 would go into that category because it includes the 30, but here it's got to be less than 30. So continuous data like this can have an infinite number of values. The groups must be able to contain any value. So the key 2 learning points so far are this. So class intervals are the groups that you put the data into. They cannot overlap and they cannot have gaps in them, okay? Now, sometimes that's accounted for by making sure we use the inequalities, or you may have had something at the end here that just went greater than or equal to 50. Okay, so that's infinite, could go on forever. At this end of the scale here, there's sometimes one that just says less than 20, okay? So we could include those as well. Okay, so here we go. Just give yourself a go at putting these into the chart, please. I want to sketch it out and have a go. Pause it, and I'll go over the answers. So making sure then that when you're putting this data in, you're putting it into the correct section. So 18 is the 10 to 20, and the 30 is the first one that you need to consider. That is the less than or equal to 30, okay? 24, 11, 13, 27, 20. Once again, it's got to be in the less than or equal to 20. There you go. And your total is sometimes called the frequency at the end there. We would have 3, 6, 9, 2. Okay. Right. When it's asking you to generate your own class intervals, just be really careful that you're including the lowest and the highest value, and then everything else is set out to include everything. So I've got my lowest value here as 17, and my highest, I believe, is 35. So as long as your class intervals go from 17 to 35 and they don't include any gaps, you'll be absolutely fine. Okay, I'm going to put it as time. You might go 20, you might go 21, and this time up to 30. You might go greater than or equal to 30, but less than 32. And you might go less than or greater than or equal to 32, but less than 40. That would include all of them, wouldn't it? Okay, so just making sure they don't overlap. Right, so key points then, as we've mentioned, class intervals, the groups you put the data into, they can't overlap and they cannot have gaps. Right, we're just going to quickly talk pros and cons of grouped data. Now, the first one, the pro, as I showed you on the graph at the beginning, is that it makes the data easy to read and understand, and it also makes it easy to spot patterns and compare the data. Cons, however, you actually lose accuracy, and you lose the accuracy because you don't have the initial data. So you lose accuracy of the data as you no longer know the exact data values. This means that you have to start estimating when you're doing calculations from it, okay? So calculations made from these will only be an estimate. For example, the mean, okay? Right, get those notes down on flashcards, practice those flashcards. I'll see you in the next video.